Thank you. On behalf of Bloomberg, I want to thank the IMED team, including Anna, Cynthia Thoduku, Staritis Strelikis, Kelly Kiki Nodavavea, and Maria Kokali for extending a gracious invitation to Bloomberg and the Bloomberg Media Initiative Africa team, represented by my colleague Marielena Hatupis and me, as well as our panelists, to join you this week for the IMED Matter of Trust Journalism Week Conference. This is a wonderful opportunity to share the stage with so many international journalists, editors, managing directors, academics, students, and news organizations who are devoted to press freedoms, accuracy in the media, its resilience and longevity, which will require vigilance, activism, education, and resources. May I also take this opportunity to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, who supports our program in Africa, specifically co-president Andreas Drakopoulos and Panos Papoulias. Excuse me. SNF's work helps us advance business and economic reporting in partnership with Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Ford Foundation by generously funding the training of university faculty in Africa in 5 countries with 10 business schools and journalism schools. Their support for international media and journalism is invaluable and critically important at this time. So thank you very much to SNF. While Marielena and I are not journalists, much of our work is in service to journalists. We are honored to be here with you. And if you would indulge me, I'd like to take a moment of silence for the journalists we have lost so far this year, and I hope we don't lose any more of our colleagues, as well as those who are being detained. Thank you. Thank you. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, I would like to set the stage for our discussion by presenting a few slides on the state of media globally. Much of this information in the presentation will not be news to many of you in the audience, but we wanted to provide insight and context for the conversation. We're going to start with the macro trends that are shaping the global media industry. We have the first, oh, excuse me, double duty. Okay. Continued growth in consumer revenues is on the top of the list. Continued decline of traditional media, which many of you have been discussing this week. Rise of platform domination of audience and ad revenues. Growth in digital media is forcing traditional media to innovate. Innovative business and models in news, and the rise of NFTs driving new models of customer engagement and loyalty. So, continued growth in consumer revenues. Consumer revenues are disproportionately flowing towards differentiated and highest quality content. And as you can see from this slide, there are about 5 media companies that are really dominating globally, with Netflix and Amazon, which are both US-based, FT, the New York Times, and Euronews. Continued decline of traditional media and the rise of digital has really been the biggest challenge many news organizations has faced in the last 10 to 15 years. Daily newspaper circulation declined by 13% between 2019 and 2020, accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Ad revenues from traditional media are expected to decline by 2.3% in 2023, which is continues to devastate traditional legacy media houses. Digital media owners, advertisers, revenues globally will continue to grow to plus 9% in 2022, reaching, 816 billion USD. And revenues from digital are expected to grow by 10.8% in 2023. Platform domination of audience and ad revenue. It's the same cast of characters: Google, Facebook, or Meta, Alibaba, Amazon, and Tencent together siphon close to 70% of total digital ad revenue globally in 2021, which is an astonishing percentage, and are projected to continue to dominate in 2022 and 2023. Growth in digital media is forcing traditional media, many of those in the room who represent media houses here in Greece and globally, to innovate. The crisis is forcing news outlets to innovate and experiment with new business models. Digital technologies reduce the costs of access to news gathering tools, lowering the price for startup, investigative, and community-based journalism, which is actually a real advantage for those of us who are entering the industry today. New startups can enter the market relatively easily and produce high-quality, independent journalism. And we'll talk more about that with our panelists. Innovative business models in news. News organizations are appealing directly to consumers for financing via direct reader donations. And almost every panelist, but particularly Evan Smith, is going to talk more about this. The rise of newsletters and social media engagement presents opportunities for individual journalists to develop their own following, free or through paid subscriptions. And we hope, Emily, you'll talk a bit more about Charter. Media companies are establishing themselves as nonprofits for tax purposes to receive charitable donations and other non-commercial forms of funding. And the Texas Tribune, who's represented today by Evan Smith, is probably the best example of this in the United States. Rise of non-fungible tokens, or also known as NFTs, drives new models of customer engagement and loyalty. The market for NFTs ballooned to $41 billion last year, and media companies have been quick to join the gold rush. I'm sorry. Companies in the media business can naturally use NFTs to create a new class of media assets and allow consumers to own an asset. The NFT market is projected to become a $211 billion market by 2030, with a compound annual growth rate of 33% from 2022 to 2030. Let me just briefly talk about some macro trends that are shaping the European media industry. European media and entertainment markets projected to experience growth through digital. Media and entertainment revenues in Greece will rise. Newspaper revenue expected to decline, which many of you are aware of. And we've talked about this all week. Trust in news has fallen, while publishers face barriers to innovation. Media and entertainment revenues in Greece will rise, and newspapers' revenue expected to decline. Media and entertainment revenues will rise at 5.84 compound annual growth rate to reach 128 million euros in 2024. And you can see from the chart what we're talking about, which is mostly not news organizations or newspapers and consumer magazines, which is actually projected to decline at a compound growth rate of 8%. Where you're seeing the largest growth is in OTT video and other related digital and media content, excuse me. Lastly, trust in news has fallen while publishers face barriers to innovation. Research indicates lower levels of overall trust in news. Finland remains the country with the highest level of trust at 69%, with Portugal and South Africa at 61%. Greece, Slovakia, and the United States comes in lowest with 27% and 26% respectively. Despite an increased usage of online platforms, European citizens trust traditional broadcast and print media more as news sources. So I guess the question for us to discuss, Emily, is well, how can we get them to consider subscribing and being members? And publishers need to innovate, but face numerous challenges. Again, many of these topics we've discussed this week, thanks to Ahmed. So let's just jump right in. In the past week, speakers and the audience have debated press freedoms, accuracy in the media, independent media, the role of journalists, the rise of autocrats, and their indifference to press freedoms, and why journalism matters, and the role of media and democracy. What I would like to explore this afternoon are different approaches to what is covered, how it is covered, analyzed, disseminated, and funded. We will spotlight media and revenue models, which may not be entirely new, but their approach to the business of journalism is bold, innovative, and timely. So I would like to start with you, Evan.
Hi.
You are the veteran journalist with over 30 years of time as a journalist, and what I'd like to start with is you've been in an enviable position in that you had a venture capitalist, John Thornton, who along with Ross Ramsey, also a veteran journalist, to fund the startup of the Texas Tribune 13 years ago. You were coming off of serving in many roles in your previous role at Texas Monthly Magazine, which was a for-profit enterprise. So I guess my first question is, why nonprofit media, why then? And talk a little bit about that business model.
Thank you, Irena. Thank you to Ahmed and to Bloomberg for asking me to come over here. I'm very happy to talk about this stuff. And look, I go back 13 years and remember the moment we were watching the number of reporters at our state capitol in Texas decline. I moved to Texas in 1991, and by the time I left to start the Texas Tribune in 2009, the number of reporters at the Capitol had dropped to a third of what it had been. And big city newspapers in Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston had shut down. And even the papers that were still around were just producing less news. But the population of the state was growing, the politics were getting more complicated, the issue set was getting more complex. So just when we needed public interest media, there was less public interest media. So we decided to be part of the solution to that and create a new organization. Honestly, if we could have made the economics work as a for-profit, Irena, we might have done that. But the reality is, and you have to lean into the reality, the for-profit economic model for providing this kind of work is broken, and it is not going to recover. In order to find the resources necessary to do a job as big as covering politics and public policy in a state as big as Texas, we had to think about a new way to do this. So we looked to our brothers and sisters in public media, public broadcasting, and said we're going to raise money from individuals, foundations, and corporate supporters. And I'm very happy that 13 years later, we've grown our staff to the largest covering a state capitol of any news organization in the entire United States, for-profit or nonprofit. And we've raised more than $112 million along the way and created a sustainable model to do this.
Thank you. one of your major funders or donors, as I said, is a venture capitalist. How much independence do you have?
Well, so he gave us $1 million at the beginning and then went away. That's my favorite.
That's nice.
My favorite kind of rich person is one who gives you money for journalism and then goes away. Because the independence of our work is all we have. The first time you compromise that independence is the last time you have a chance to. I can always get more money. I can't get more integrity. And so we put a distance between ourselves and our funders always. Look, here's the thing I'm proudest of. $112 million or more raised. The largest donor to the Tribune over time is only about $5 million. So less than 4%, or about 4%. And the reality is that someone who only is into you for 4% over time doesn't have the ability to control you. We've never had a problem with any donor thinking they could control the work that we do. We established that at the very beginning, and I think that all nonprofits have an obligation to set those standards out early and then adhere to them.
I certainly agree. As a funder, I certainly agree. Khadija, you're a journalist. You've been editor-in-chief of the Mail and Guardian in South Africa, executive editor at Vox. You've written for other international publications, including the Daily Maverick in South Africa. You are now on the funding side of the table. Do you want to talk to us a bit about your role at the International Fund for Public Interest Media?
Thanks very much, Rana. So I'm a journalist, and I feel very strongly about identifying myself as a journalist, because if I'm not a journalist, then what am I? For me, journalism is a compulsion more than anything else. I couldn't possibly be anything else but a journalist. But my career has spanned both the opportunity, the massive opportunity of digital technology, and then also its very limiting and constricting impact on journalism. So my career has embraced the opportunity in that I came to journalism in a very distinct way in some ways, because I didn't go to journalism school. I was a blogger. That's how I came into journalism, and it was actually another speaker here at the conference, Nick Dawes, who was at that time the editor of the Mail and Guardian, who noticed me on Twitter and kind of, you guys should follow her, right? And that was the first kind of support that I had. And a few years down the line, I took his job, right? It was long gone. So my career has, I would not have been a journalist in the same way that I am now had it not been for digital technology, right? But what I found in being a newsroom leader, because in between you mentioned the Daily Vox, where I was a co-founder of a digital news startup aimed at young people in South Africa, and then as editor-in-chief of the Mail and Guardian, which is about a 35-year-old independent weekly newspaper in the country, I really felt the impact, the shrinking of our newsrooms. Abin, you said that the number of journalists in taxes had shrunk by a third. So in South Africa, research has shown that we're at a half in 10 years. So research has shown that over 10 years, the number of journalists in formal employment in South Africa has halved. So this has a profound impact on a newsroom leader trying to do good journalism, trying to hold power to account at what has been, at various times, very crucial moments in South Africa's democracy. And at various points, Irana, the reason I said that I love journalism, that's why I started off saying that, is I felt that the experience was actually dispiriting. Because what I was managing, particularly in my role as editor of the Mail and Guardian, was round after round of layoffs. And just trying to keep the lights on, and that's just not healthy for me personally, but also for organizations and also for the larger ecosystem, especially when these organizations are what stands between states and tyranny, right? And that's why I am invested in trying to find a future for global news media. And that's why I've left the newsroom and come to the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which is basically a new financing mechanism for media.
And it's an international fund. Talk a bit about the geography and how it's going to be structured, and what type of journalism will you be funding?
So I guess we have the most boring name. Kind of like what we do is on the box. It's International Fund for Public Interest Media. So it's definitely public interest media that we want to support. And we have a particular definition for public interest media that will sound much better when you receive it in writing. But basically, media that exists for the public's interest and not for any political or commercial interest. That's basically the kind of media that we want to support. Our current geographic focus is in low and middle income countries. As the lifespan of the fund expands and our funding sources hopefully expand with that, we might shift beyond that. But right now, every time I'm speaking in Europe, I feel terrible to say this, but as bad as it is here, and as bad as it is in the US, it's much worse in Africa, right? So that's why there has to be some kind of initiative that is particularly focusing on those geographies that are hit worst, with fewer venture capitalists who are going to come with no strings attached to innovative new models. And that's what we're doing.
Thank you. Emily, you're a writer, researcher, producer. I was so impressed with your CV, journalist. You've written for The Guardian, The New York Times, Time, and you're currently head of research at Charter. And before we jump into Charter, could you talk a bit about the membership puzzle project, which was a collaboration with the Dutch journalism platform The Correspondent and NYU, New York University, on how to build a sustainable news organization and bring trust back to the industry. Can you talk a bit about that, and also the work that you did in evaluating the work of the Tribune? You mentioned that.
Thank you so much for having us. The Membership Puzzle Project is a now intentionally sunset public interest research project that went about trying to understand from media consumers' perspectives their unmet needs when it came to journalism that was trustworthy, that was affordable, and that was well worth their time. And as a grant-funded academic research project, we went around the world to study news organizations, some of which are here. Decat o Revista from Romania is just one of many examples, where there was something unique. There was some sort of really provocative experimentation happening between a news organization and the people it looked to serve, or its members. And we really wanted to understand that social contract, that yes, in some places being able to pay with your money, more like a subscription model, was a great way to sort of codify that social compact. And we saw many examples around the world where community members were involved as technical proofreaders or language translators or community ambassadors, or in some other way paid in participation in ways that were really meaningful to the organization. And it's interesting because we had looked at so many different types of markets, and there's no doubt that there is quite a bit of market differentiation and cultural appropriation around paying for news. I want to state that really plainly, that none of these two markets is exactly the same, and it is really important, and something that I still stress in advising news organizations is really going to your community members to understand what it is they need. Because what they need is not necessarily what the national publications in your country offer. It's not what your #1 competition as you see it offers. And so really going in pursuit of those answers by talking to prospective members, engaging them in conversation, understanding what drives them mad about mainstream media and how to go about addressing it are all really important. And in all of these markets, whether we were in South Africa or whether we were in Minnesota in the United States, there were a couple of themes that came up again and again in news organizations that really continually enlisted their community members' support, sort of year over year giving of some kind. The first thing was transparency. So let me know what you're up to, be clear in your intentions and in your work, and let me know where the resources I'm offering to you are going. So be clear and upfront in that way. Be unique. We heard so many stories of points of frustration with the news of the day, stories that just felt pile on. It didn't feel like there was a unique perspective or certainly any kind of solutions orientation. And so here the idea of stand out and do the thing that only you are well poised to do. And then the third thing that we heard again and again was the importance of a calming user experience.
What does that look like? Calming user experience.
So essentially, the way that this came across was people saying, when I come to your site or your app or your main page, your home page, or your page one, your A1, let me make sense of a complex news topic. Don't be bombarding me with these horrible ads. There's a way that you can host advertising that treats me like a human being, but let me make sense of really complex topics. Let me understand others' opinions on them. And for heaven's sakes, make it straightforward how I can pay you for your work. And Texas Tribune was one of the first places that we went during their annual Trib Fest, and an annual gathering of politicians and policymakers and people of great importance in the state. And it was very quickly that we started to hear over and over again Texas Tribune members referring to the organization as we. We were on TV. I don't know if you saw this. We were on TV. No one says that, by the way, about CNN. No one.
Except Christine.
And she is right too. But that's very rare, and that sort of example really tips us off that people feel like I might not agree with everything this news organization publishes, but I know the world is brighter because it's holding power to account.
Thank you. And picking up on that, Evan, you really have knocked the ball out of the park. What's the secret sauce? Why do you have such a successful model? And maybe we can bring up the revenue slides so our colleagues can understand where you're generating your revenue.
So the first question to me is easy. Every community in the United States, every community around the world needs a news organization that searches for the truth and tells you what they find. Every community deserves a news organization that holds people in power and institutions accountable. Every community deserves a news organization that tees up for the people in that community the things important enough to stop and pay attention to. To me, this is fairly simple. This is something that we in the media have forgotten, maybe in some places, that we have as a responsibility and an obligation. So if you present to a community, these are the things I'm going to do for you, what we're going to do for you, ideally that's the reaction that you get, that people begin to think about you as being for them. This work is being done with you in mind, for you. You are part of the conversation. So I referred earlier to more than $112 million that we've raised. We have a revenue model that is diverse. We don't rely on one source. The top line major gifts, this is all over time. If you look at the very bottom behind Khadija, this is as of about a month ago, the last time that we updated this slide. So it's a little bit more at this point. We've raised almost $28 million from wealthy individuals in and out of Texas. These are gifts from individuals or family offices of more than $5,000. If you are going to raise money from wealthy individuals. It helps to have some. In Texas, we have a lot of rich people. More than 10% of the Forbes 400, the list that just came out, those folks are based in Texas, and we get the most Republicans and the most Democrats to support us.
Your
side by
publication is
side.
nonpartisan.
We're
right,
nonpartisan,
Evan?
and I think in some ways the best check on that is take a look at who funds us. If both sides are funding us, both sides, I assure you, are not happy with us all the time. But if we were for one side or the other side expressly, we would not be enjoying the kind of support we're getting from both sides. Foundations is institutional philanthropy, national foundations like the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and then all the big foundations in Texas. Membership is what Emily is talking about, regular folks who just believe that we have their backs in the work that we do, and they can turn to us for reliable, credible, independent information when they need it the most. And we've generated more than $11 million in membership contributions, just past 10,000 members for the first time in 13 years, supporting our work statewide. Corporate sponsorship, if you squint really hard, looks like advertising, but these are the sort of corporate brands who support public media. And again, $18 million over time in support from corporations big and small, and then more than $18 million in editorial events. Only one event a year, the Texas Tribune Festival, is ticketed. The rest are free, supported by sponsorship. But we have generated, mostly through sponsorship over time, more than $18 million in editorial events. Elected officials on a stage like this one, in front of an audience like that one, cameras rolling, on the record, journalists asking the hard questions that the people in the audience would ask if they had the chance to do it. And then about $4 million or a little bit more in earned income, licensing of content, and other of what I would describe as work-for-hire stuff. So that gets you to $112 million. We don't rely on any one line to carry us over the finish line in any year or over time. And this has created for us a sustainable model. Arena, we have more money in the bank than we've ever had. We're going to raise more money this year than we ever have. We're largely recession-proof in the way that we've operated because we've been through a couple of economic downturns and we have not had down years because the value of this work is most important in the most difficult times.
And how large is your newsroom?
So we started with 17 on the first day, 11 journalists. Today we have 95 full-time, approaching 100 on staff, and more than 50 journalists in our newsroom covering the state capitol. We are about half the press corps in Austin at our state capitol, just the Texas Tribune.
It's astonishing. It's just wonderful that you were able to bring back all of these journalists who had lost their jobs previously. Just want to spend just a bit more time on the events. Last night we talked about the festival, but you also mentioned about 50 smaller events that are hosted across the state at different universities. Do you want to talk about that?
Very quickly, we do an average, before the pandemic, I would say we were doing an average of about 50 events a year, so about one a week, big and small. We travel around the state of Texas, very large state, north, south, east, and west. We partner with colleges and universities and communities, big and small, bring elected officials onto their campuses with our journalists, and have public events at the breakfast hour or the lunch hour that are free to attend, sponsored by various entities to allow us to be free. The university is very happy to partner with us in giving us access to the venues. And these are elected officials who are being brought back home, in many cases, before the people they represent, so they really can't say no if you ask them to do the event. Because people in the community will hear, well, your state senator, we invited him to come out and talk about the work he's doing on your behalf, but he couldn't make time for that. So we get pretty much everybody in both parties. We do those events, as I said, about an average of one per week over the course of the year, and it's a terrific way. It's live journalism. It's accountability journalism in real time. And the people in those communities feel indebted to us because for them it's very often the first time they've been in the same room with the person who represents them at our Capitol, making decisions that affect their lives every single day.
So it's a ticketed event, so folks...
No, it's a free event,
but it's sponsored by corporations.
But we have sponsors who we acknowledge at the beginning. They never come on stage with us. Of course, I carry all those sponsors around. It's basically like a NASCAR jacket that I wear from one side of the state to the other with corporate logos on it. But the reality is those people don't impact our journalism. They're not on stage with us, but they enable us economically to produce that kind of work, and it benefits everybody.
Thank you. Khadija, we know this model is, there are elements of what Evan does that is replicable, but not in all cases. But I suspect that you're going to be looking to some of the same entities to fund the International Media Fund for Public Interest. Who have you started, who are you looking at? Are you going to rely primarily on foundations, governments? Talk a little bit about how the fund will be financed.
So the important thing to recognize about the International Fund is that it's not another foundation. It is a multilateral initiative. And we really want to reassert the value of multilateralism again. I think especially at the moment that the world is navigating, it's really, really important for us to re-embrace multilateralism, to think about collective action again. So our sources of funding will come from three primary parts. The first is through the development aid budgets of high-income countries. So far, research has shown that 0.3% of development aid worldwide goes to media development. Only Sweden spends more than 1% on media development. We believe that all states that have development aid budgets should be spending 1%. And think about it, 1%. We're not asking for 10, we're asking for 1%. But it's going to take us a while to get to 1%. We're trying to nudge that 0.3 figure to 0.5, and even getting it to 0.5 means a step change of hundreds of millions of dollars annually going to media development. That's really, really important. And I want to emphasize, we're not looking to redirect existing funding. What is really, really important is for us to use this moment to say, this is a crisis that we face as humanity. And we're going to dig deep to try to ensure that people around the world have access to information. That's what we're asking. So we're asking the states, much like Evan asks his billionaires to give him money and hands off, we're asking the states as well, the states that we work with, you're giving us money, but you're not telling us who to fund. And you're not going to tell us, fund that kind of editorial and not that kind. So our independence is secured because this, governments are not directly involved in our funding decisions. We have an independent board chaired by Mark Thompson and Maria Ressa, two of the best known journalists around the world. But that's the first part of funding. The second part is, yes, foundations. There are many foundations who don't have media programs because they find it to be too complicated. And it is a very specific kind of funding. Irana, you know that.
I know that, and it can be extremely controversial, right?
Exactly, exactly. So what we are offering is a body that insulates all of the states, the philanthropies. We do the hard work of deciding where the funding goes and how that gets through. So it's, but again, it's not about redirecting. We're not saying, Bloomberg, give us, your Africa program to do it through us. Instead, we're saying, hey, Bloomberg, how about another check, right? That's me making a pitch on stage, by the way, guys.
Noted.
So that's, that is really, really important. I think that I want to emphasize that it's new money. And it's really about trying to ensure that we recognize the moment. And I don't want to be alarmist, but I think that there is a sense of alarm here in Greece. From the few days that I've been here, you understand the precarity of your news media ecosystem as it is right now. And that precarity is replicated around the world. And unless we have very urgent action, we're going to, I think, have a very bleak future.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm going to jump from nonprofit media to a form of media that is growing exponentially in the United States, and that is newsletters. I don't know how familiar the European market or European journalists are familiar with this new format, but it is really taking off in the United States, and it's largely for-profit newsletters. And Emily recently joined Charter, which is a newsletter that is providing analysis of workplace trends, which I thought was sort of, I don't know what the timing was. I don't recall if it preceded COVID, but I thought, who could have known that the future of work would be such a major issue globally, not just in the United States. And Kevin Delaney and your colleagues, I think many of whom came from the New York Times, decided to focus this newsletter on the future of work. Talk a little bit about sort of what was the impetus for the newsletter. And you follow trends in media. Why do you think that newsletters are catching on?
I'll speak first to the beat that we cover, which is labor. It's workplace reporting, and then I'll talk a little bit about our formats and finally our funding, if that works. So actually, before the pandemic, Kevin Delaney and a few thought partners had started to, and Kevin had been the editor-in-chief of the business section at the Wall Street Journal and co-founder of Quartz, a business site. And he really started to notice, the way that we work is changing in ways that are good and in ways that are still being formed. And the pandemic and people working, white-collar workers working from home, questions about health and safety, the George Floyd murder in the US, and corresponding protests, all sort of led to something that maybe we were starting to track, to the story. And so he started a newsletter called Reset Work, with the idea that the way that we gather as teams was being forcibly reset in many instances. And that has been absolutely an evergreen story for us and for our peer set. I would say one thing that is different in our approach is that we really take almost a solutions journalism or a service journalism type approach. So if the Wall Street Journal is reporting on office dress codes are changing, we would look at that about 25 degrees off center and say, so how can you create a more inclusive dress code for the people you want to hire and retain? Knowing that long gone are the days when an organization's equipment would, that a firm's infrastructure was its most valuable asset. The talent is the asset today in many, many instances. And so this little newsletter started gaining steam. We undertook a publishing partnership with Time Magazine, and we publish all of their future of work coverage. And we now have a free advertising-supported 3 times a week newsletter that is news and sort of research. Basically, what does the literature about how to manage effective teams show us? And this was incredibly effective to me as a resource when I was on the leadership team at The Atlantic, because we saw there was no playbook for this sort of uncharted time within our workforce. We also have book briefings. We read management books, so you don't have to. And then once a week, we have a column by Esmitra Kalita of URL Media, who offers really practical, hands-on guidance. So we have the newsletter, and that is, we do want to keep it freely available to managers. We see them as sort of the core readership. We also have, and it's actually coming up this week, a free charter workplace summit, and that's a hybrid event. We're obsessed with all of this literature, and so just as IMED has an in-person component and a virtual one, we are sort of trying to tell these stories from people who are innovative within their businesses. And that, again, is sponsored. Very much like how Evan was talking about sponsorships and sort of advertising partnerships. We also, along the way, tried online courses and found they were not quite the right, they weren't an ideal delivery mechanism for us. There's an immense amount of time. If you've ever taught an online course, you know it's a lot of time and material that goes into it. Very high, audience members rightfully have very high expectations of production value, and the information by the time you have an entire course available can feel stale. And so we started to think, well, okay, you know, our co-founders, Jay Loff, Kevin Delaney, and Aaron Grau, are being asked all the time to come in and give executive workshops. Show me what you know. Help me think through how we're going to troubleshoot in this particular area. Maybe it's something like, how do we bring salary transparency into all of our job postings? Something that is actually more complex than it might seem at first blush. Or considerations like, how do we really level our promotion criteria for internal staff and make it as fair as possible across all of the places where our people work? And we were getting enough requests that we started to say, you know what, there maybe is a premium membership idea in here. And by actually working with chief human resources officers, so the people who run the talent agenda within their organizations, if we can offer some on-demand expertise, workshops, and material for people who are really in those decision-making capacities, we think that that is going to serve them, and it's going to serve our for-profit business. And so we're in the very early days bringing together sort of the initial cohort of Charter Pro members. In the States, we have very much been influenced by Axios Pro, Politico Pro on the politics side. And we are very committed to maintaining the free portion of our work because we want to transform more workplaces. We know that the way that we are working does not work, that the existing guidance is not helping our teams succeed. It's not helping people thrive. And after our co-founders led teams of hundreds of people, they really experienced how broken our ways of working are.
Yeah. So do you think, putting on your sort of business development hat and your researcher hat, that there will increasingly be a market for specialized and niche publications like newsletters that are just really focused on one specific industry?
I think so. And there's sort of like two factors that I think really are important here. The first is the sort of single issue newsrooms, going back to that earlier idea of knowing their constituent or their reader base really well, being in touch with those people, knowing what is it that's keeping them up at night? What are their fears and frustrations in their space? What is the news they're not able to get anywhere else is a great way to do that. The other thing is, our email service provider costs and the cost of our reporting and editing staff, that's a lot fewer line items than publications that are publishing in print. And so when we just look at the margins, also the fact that we can see a trend sort of burgeoning and we can take a few different ways into the story in a way that is really, really rapid, and it's sort of experimenting our way forward there.
I know that Graydon Carter, who used to be the editor of Vanity Fair, he now has, I think it's a newsletter, he might call it a blog, and it's subscription-based, but it's also free. But increasingly, more and more journalists who are no longer writing for large publications are sort of taking this route. You have any thoughts on this, Evan, and on the burgeoning podcast phenomenon that's also taking place in the United States?
I'd say that quickly, I'd say there's not one answer, not one right answer. There just has to be a right answer, and for a certain niche subject or a certain publication, that right answer may be audio distribution. It may be email newsletter distribution. I think for a lot of us, any and all is becoming the strategy, right? Whatever works, so we try a little bit here and there, and we have to be willing to experiment, even if everything doesn't always work.
Yeah. And Emily mentioned Charter's collaboration with Time. I know you have a collaboration with the Washington Post. You want to talk a bit about that?
Well, our approach from the very beginning has been that a public service mission does not want to be cannot be accomplished behind a paywall. Let me say it that way. Our content needs to be in front of as many people as possible for us to achieve the goal, which is to get as many people into a conversation about these things that matter to all of them in their lives. So we've been giving our content away for free from the very first day to be republished, to be re-aired, and to be reposted. We were actually in a relationship with the New York Times for the first 4 years, and then that pivoted over to a relationship that is ongoing today with the Washington Post. So you will sometimes see Texas Tribune stories online or occasionally in the paper. You will see Washington Post stuff that's related to Texas back on our website. And our stuff runs in the pages of newspapers all over Texas. In many communities where there's basically no news, we are the only ones providing original reporting in those papers. Again, giving it away for free doesn't help the economic model directly. But indirectly, we get members in those communities, we get major donors in those communities who see us as helping the people in their community to better understand the state. We see major sponsorships result from those distribution partnerships. So again, there's not a right way to do this. There's a lot of wrong ways. The trick is to avoid a wrong way. But you have to be willing to experiment with what might not be a right way, but it might work, and you've got to be comfortable enough taking that chance.
Thank you. So I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has any questions. Don't be shy. Thank you.
I don't want to ask a controversial question, but I do. How much of the funding that you get from your corporate sponsors do you actually counter-report against, such as any of them?
It's a great question. You know, there's nothing in the world that I like more than taking the head of a corporate sponsor off publicly, because it proves that we're independent of our sources of funding. So we approach the question of independence in two ways. First of all, we are compulsively transparent about our sources of funding. You can go on our website right now, and you can see every single dollar donated to the Texas Tribune, all $112 million from the very beginning down to the penny. And we disclose donations, member donations, major gifts, corporate support in as close to real time as possible. And at the end of every single story, auto-generated by the CMS at the Texas Tribune is a paragraph listing everybody in every single story with a financial relationship now or previous with the Tribune. So there's absolutely no way that you can avoid knowing whether we're writing about somebody that's had a financial relationship with us. But beyond that, we tell our donors, major donors as well as corporate sponsors, if the journalism that we do runs perpendicular into you, we're going to choose the journalism over you. And we have lost corporate sponsors who gave us money, and then we turned around and wrote negative stories about them that needed to be done, and they stopped funding us, and I said, good. We can always get more money, but that proves the independence of the model. We've done that repeatedly, and I could cite example after example, names you might know and names that you would not. But we don't ever hesitate to write about the people who support us financially, and if they don't like what we've written, we'll just go get other money.
Yeah, it's really hard to pay to get your credibility back, right?
You can't
get it back. Right here. Oh, they're going to bring a mic over to you.
Thanks. It's a great discussion. There are many things I want to ask. But I just start with Google and the way it gets the content from newspapers. And I think there is only one place, is it Australia, that has gone to challenge this and ask for Google to pay, because this is a piracy that really changes the game.
There's no question about it. When other news organizations started to post on their sites, and Apple, they were so eager to get in front of that audience, that they were not asking, well, the platforms weren't even offering to pay. They were like, you want to be on my platform? You just give us your content. We're not going to pay you for it, because they just didn't feel that they had to. And Emily and Khadija, I mean, you can all speak about this. I know in the case of Bloomberg, we pushed back. We were like, hey, no, this doesn't work for us. Because, you know, I think many news organizations thought, once I'm on your platform, then the reader will go to their website, to the news organization's website. But in fact, that didn't happen. They stayed on the social media platform. And so it really, to your point, it was a form of piracy in a way. I mean, I don't mean to be provocative, but it was really, everything was sort of on the side of the platform, right? But now they are beginning to pay for content from news organizations. I don't know if Khadija and you and Emily want to talk about this?
So just very quickly, and I think Australia is a good example. I think many of us were very skeptical when that news bargaining code was announced in Australia, simply because it was being promoted by Rupert Murdoch. But I think there are many, many lessons, and I think there's some initial research that's shown that it's actually been really successful. Australian newsrooms are hiring in a way that they have not hired in 20 years. There are opportunities suddenly in Australian newsrooms, and I think that I'm encouraged that I think there's similar legislation being mulled here in Europe by the EU. So hopefully there's some action there.
I'll just quickly say there's an amazing nonprofit investigative news organization that focuses on algorithmic accountability, all female-led. It's based in the US but looks well beyond, called The Markup, that I would highly, highly recommend for these topics.
Thanks. I had a question for Evan. You said, if I understood correctly, that you also have a lot of wealthy Republican donors.
We do.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because you also run investigative articles on, for example, border control, immigration, gun laws that might be,
right,
you know, contrary to standardly held Republican
beliefs. Yeah, it's the greatest magic trick we've pulled off, is taking money from the kind of people who then go out to a bank of microphones and complain about the fake news. I wish I could tell you how we've done it.
Yeah, that was the question. What do you think it is about the...
Well, I mean, I think if, you know, we have made this about democracy and not journalism. And I know it's fashionable these days to talk about how democracy in the United States is hanging by a thread. No, it really is. And I think for the majority of people, not everybody, when you make this about creating more thoughtful and informed citizens in a state like Texas, motivating civic participation, and promising, and not only promising, but demonstrating that you don't have a thumb on the scale for either side, that you're willing to pull no punches, but hit both cheeks, right? That's how we tell our reporters to think about the work they do. Pull no punches, but hit both cheeks. If you're only holding one side accountable, you're doing it wrong. I think after a while, people see we're serious about doing the kind of work that is truly down the middle and does not advantage one side or another. And so we've been able to make a pitch to many of these folks who are themselves political donors, who have an investment in that space. You know, we're the best way for you to look after your investment. We're the best ones to support, so that we can tell you, are these issues being dealt with in a way that you support or oppose? Are the candidates you're giving money to getting elected or not, doing the things in office that they said they were going to do or not? You know, we don't get every one of them, I promise you. But we have, at this point, I would say, a fairly equal number of donors on both sides. And look, what motivates any individual donor is different from what motivates any other individual donor. But I would say as a group, it has been about, more than anything else, making this not about journalism, but about democracy.
Thank you.
I think at this point, many of them want to be associated with your publication.
Sure. Yeah. I'll take that.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have. Oh, we're taking more questions. Okay, great.
It's just a quick one
Okay.
for Evan. I was just wondering how many people you have working on getting donations in your organization.
That's a good question.
We have a development team of 4. We have a major gifts and foundations officer, and then we have some folks who support that chief development officer. And of course, you know, in any organization like this, Khadija knows this, Emily knows this, the CEO had better also be an additional weapon in the toolbox. I spend a lot of my time out raising money from folks. It's, you know, just as diversity and equity within a staff is not any one person's job, but it's everybody's job, I would actually argue that fundraising is everybody's job. Membership is everybody's job. We all believe in what we do. We all have to be willing to work to make that a reality.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.